This video is brought to you with the support of Movie Poster Archives, the only nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of movie accessories, and the following LAMP sponsors.
Starting in 1912 and expanding to all major and most minor studios, production, distribution, and marketing stills were controlled and tracked by an accounting process called production codes. Production codes were a way for the studio to keep track of the massive amount of material utilized or produced in the making of a particular film. They were used to mark the costumes, props, and more important to us, movie stills. For this series, our focus will be the stills, as the costumes and props could be reused in a variety of productions. Please note that the following information is based on the general process followed by major studios for decades before the digital revolution. Each studio would vary these procedures to meet their own specific needs. We will cover some of these variations later in the series. Executives at the major studios were monitoring multitudes of films, so they didn't want all the details. Management only wanted to know basic information such as what was being filmed, who's the film's director, are there any major changes or modifications, when was filming completed. Many studios utilized an executive production board, like the one shown here from 1918. This board showed the names of different directors and the progress of their work. At a moment's glance, you could see how many actors are at work, how many scenes completed, and whether they are filming in the studio or out doing exteriors. Some executives wanted a system to keep track of the basics that could be occasionally updated. A production number/code was created to follow through the process because quite often titles or directors would change. Each studio would assign a specific number based on their unique numbering system at the time to their individual film projects. That number was used as a control number to all projects assigned to that particular film. These codes were usually added somewhere during pre-production when the decision is made by the executives to proceed with the film. Most production numbers follow a pattern. The first numbers or letters would indicate the film's identification. The second number would indicate the individual still number. This is the production code. The number 1060 identifies the MGM production Wizard of Oz, and the -94 is the individual still number. It's from the 1939 classic MGM film, Wizard of Oz, still number 94. Production codes were not always numbers. Some studios preferred letters or a letter and number combination. Different studios used slightly different systems. Some codes are extremely simple to figure out. For instance, most of the Fox film codes that we have on file from 1917 to 1932 were letter codes. Most of them were by directors. For example, in 1925, Frank Borzage went to work for Fox Film and coded all of his films using BOR- and a number of that film with Fox. Here is the still of Charles Farrell in one of Borzage's most famous films, the 1927 film Seventh Heaven. The marking on the still indicated a production code, BOR 7-38. This code would indicate that this was Borzage's seventh film, still number 38. Continuing the pattern, Borzage's sixth film with Fox was the 1926 film Marriage License and carried the code BOR 6. His eighth film was Street Angel and carried the code BOR 8. Some codes make perfect sense and some don't. Why? Because so many changes can happen during filming, editing, post-production, and final release. Many times, in the planning stage, a title would be set based on an important phrase or a book name. In this case, the production code was set with the title codes from the beginning. But sometimes the studio was not sure what the final title was going to be. In this case, they would assign a working title and a temporary production code. On occasion, the production code would be based on a particular star's project. For example, the production code number JH11 represents Jack Holt's project number 11 for the Jack Holt film Strange Case of Dr. Mead. The publicity department would then determine if a code conflicted with other projects and how it would be changed. In the case of Strange Case of Dr. Mead, after editing, a simple addition to the Columbia code was added to become JHCOL11. The publicity department began to use production codes for several other areas, such as images that could also be used for special promotions beyond that film's promotions. Here is the first of two stills featuring Merle Oberon from the 1946 film Temptation. Notice the BD 110 scratched into the bottom left. BD is the production code for Temptation and 110 is the still number. The film was based on the 1909 novel by Robert Smythe Hickens called Belladonna, BD. Now here's another still of Merle Oberon from the same film. Notice that on this still, the code is MO16. MO was the portrait code for Merle Oberon. While production codes were used for scenes in the film, portrait codes were used for accounting purposes and for photos that could be used for other publicity besides just that particular film. Numerous studios used the portrait code for more than just the celebrities. Some studios also included directors, producers, writers, cameramen, and, especially at Paramount, anyone employed by the studio, craft workers, drama coaches, and secretaries, or anyone connected to a film, such as the author or real-life subject of a biography. Some codes were even assigned for groups of individuals and screen couples that were in the public eye a lot. Here's an example. Notice that the bottom right corner has the portrait code of TH4, which represents Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Unfortunately, there's no indication of the movie title, but it is portrait still number 4 of the couple. Let's take a look at how studios created and utilized production codes. We'll start with Paramount Pictures, as records seem to indicate that they were the first to create and the most aggressive in the use of production codes. In 1912, funds from Adolphe Zukor were used to complete the French film The Loves of Elizabeth, Queen of England. Zukor brought the film to the U.S., and it became the first release from the Famous Players Film Company. Famous Players later became Famous Players Lasky, and then Paramount Pictures in 1914. The stills issued for this film contained a production number of 1, as can be seen in the lower right of the still, and at the top of the production code listing. The first production codes that we have on file start in 1912. You can see the films made before 1914 when the name was changed to Paramount. Paramount continuously pushed the envelope with new innovations, streamlining the production process and using control boards for directors. They were also the most aggressive with copyrights and distribution. Here is a look at an executive production board in 1918. This board showed the names of different directors and the progress of their work. As stated in our stills section, at a moment's glance you could see how many actors are at work, how many scenes completed, and whether they are filming in the studio or out doing exteriors. In the early years, Paramount utilized a simple number system, as seen on their production code list. But by the early 1920s, Paramount had both an East Coast and West Coast production office. This developed into a very confusing dual system, with each office creating their own production codes. Their California offices used an L series code while their New York office used the code NYKN, New York key numbers. Quite often a title would be presented in both series types with different numbers assigned. In the late 1920s, Paramount developed other systems. Here is a very rare look at one of the main systems used by Paramount. These were called route cards, and they were kept in a ring binder. The ones we have on file are 1940s to 1960s and were issued about every 2 months before and during World War II, but went to monthly as production picked up after World War II. They continued using these for many years. Here's a look at cards with temporary codes. The sample shows 3 of the cards for May, June, and July 1948. On the June card, the entry on the bottom reads 11513, Samson and Delilah, 2nd Unit, DIR, DeMille. Notice on the July card where the new number, 11449, shows as the production code for Samson and Delilah with DeMille as the director. The bottom of the July card shows the temporary unit codes. Once the filming was complete, temporary codes were eliminated and only the primary number used. Here's a sample on title changes on two cards from May and June of 1962. Code number 10381 has a name change from Together in Paris to become Paris when it sizzles. Code 10383 starts out as Papa's delicate condition. And finally, a sample on how TV series codes were listed in blocks. By this time, TV had become a major part of production as well and was integrated into the system, but a little differently. Each TV episode had its own production code number. Notice that they would allocate a block of 50 numbers at a time. When they finished that block of 50, if the show was going to continue, they would allocate another block of 50 until the show was canceled. Paramount portrait codes almost always have a P in front of a 3 or 4-digit number, as seen on the Martha Ray still. Unlike other studios, Paramount normally did not issue all the multiple codes except for when someone left the company and then came back later. In this case, a new code would usually be assigned. Paramount continued to expand their use of production codes to include employees of all levels, from production to office workers and all the way to groundskeepers and janitors. They also expanded to all types of promotional groups, social groups, and even book authors. Paramount explored just about every way that a control number, or a production code, could be used. Now, let's go from the first to the worst as it relates to the use of production codes. Columbia's production codes are, by far, the most confusing and most difficult to use for identification. Let's take a look, and you will quickly see that this may be an indication that Columbia did not understand or know how to utilize production codes for quite a while. Columbia Studios started production codes for their 1926 to 1927 season. The first film to have a code was False Alarm, which was issued a C1 production code. They produced 24 films that season, marking them C1 through C24. The next season, 1927 to 1928, they produced 30 films, with the first one being The Blood Ship. Instead of issuing new production codes, they simply started over with their numbering, marking them C1 through C30. The next season, 1928 to 1929, they produced 31 films, starting with Court Martial. Again, they simply started their numbering system over, marking them C1 through C31. Columbia repeated this production code numbering pattern until approximately 1937. This resulted in Columbia having numerous C1 codes, numerous C2, numerous C3, etc. for each year of production starting with 1926. Adding to the confusion is the fact that Columbia numbered their codes based on filming seasons and not by calendar years, resulting in duplicate numbers crossing seasons. For example, C6 in the 1930 to 1931 season was The Lion and the Lamb, while C6 in the 1931 to 1932 season was Men in Her Life. Both films were released in 1931, even though they were from two different filming seasons. The Lion and the Lamb was released in January, and The Men in Her Life was released in December. You can see the C6 on each. Over the years, Columbia introduced new prefixes. However, many of these stills were also released with the C prefix. In the 1934 season, Columbia used the prefix A-COL. The next season, beginning 1935, the prefix was B-COL. For the 1936 to 1937 season, Columbia used C-COL as their primary prefix. From 1937 to 1943, Columbia used a D-COL prefix. From 1943 to 1956, they changed to just a D- and a number, and starting in 1957, they changed to using CPC as the prefix. These overlapping different prefixes, along with the fact that Columbia sometimes issued new codes for re-releases, creates film titles with multiple varying production codes for the same movie. Columbia production codes can give you nightmares. As for portraits, instead of utilizing portrait codes, Columbia usually wrote the celebrity's name out in full. Here's a sample of the portrait still of Leslie Brooks, which has her name written in the bottom left corner. We have presented the first, most aggressive, and most variations at utilizing production codes, and presented the worst and most confusing studio utilizing production codes. Other major studios that used production codes created systems that fall somewhere in between. All major studios were also distributors for smaller production studios and would also bring in films made in other countries, so they had to have a system to control a wide variety of situations. For example, you had situations like Fox Films, who used a letter series merging with 20th Century, who used an XXC-number series, to become 20th Century Fox, who then primarily used a number system with letter-number for special situations. And many variations in between, but all using the same concept. Because of the number and wide variation, we will not address them individually in this presentation. But we are in the process of a more in-depth and advanced presentation for those interested, coming soon. The minor studios present a different situation. Some of the earlier studios used production codes, and some didn't. Their interest was in the production of the film only, as they normally didn't distribute their films, but looked to a major studio to distribute them. In this case, it became more of a distribution code, as the distributor might keep the code the studio put, but usually would assign their own code in addition that fit into their system. This would mean that they might erase the code from the production company, or it would create multiple codes on the still. Before we look at common problems, remember that these codes were used for control at that particular time for that particular purpose. Studios didn't take into consideration that people would be trying to use these markings decades later to identify untitled movie stills, costumes, and props. There are many problems that can be encountered when using production codes to identify untitled movie stills. However, there are situations that commonly occur. These include pre-production stills, confusion with NSS numbers, studio-issued mistakes, multiple production codes, handwritten mistakes, backwards printing, production code chopped, movie remakes. Now let's take a look at these common problems. Pre-production stills. It was not uncommon for studios to assign pre-production codes and working titles to films in their early stages. This information would ultimately be replaced with permanent codes and titles. Unfortunately, some studios would erase all pre-production markings and records, resulting in stills with numbers and titles that are no longer recorded. This creates an identification nightmare. Confusion with National Screen Service numbers. Here's an easy problem of recognition. In the 1960s, some studios started printing production codes with still descriptions. This practice went on into the 2000s. The problem is some of them looked like NSS numbers instead of production codes. Here's an example from The Sound of Music. Notice The Sound of Music had a production code of 79/. Many collectors took them for NSS numbers until they saw multiples with different still numbers. Studio-issued mistakes. Collectors rely on the studio stills having the correct information. On occasion, a studio will issue stills incorrectly identified. Here's an example of a still which states it's from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner with an amazingly young Spencer Tracy and Sidney Poitier. And here's another one from that film. This one features a slightly older Tracy and Poitier. Obviously, both of these stills are incorrectly identified. The first is from Captain's Courageous and the second from Boys Town. Luckily, the production code on each was correct. The point is this: just because it's issued by the studio doesn't automatically make it correct. Multiple codes on a still. We touched on this lightly in minor studios, but you will find multiple codes on a still quite frequently for a couple of reasons. Notice this still from Limelight. This is from the 1972 re-release. The original was released in 1952. Here is the bottom right corner showing 3 production codes. CC is the production code for Charles Chaplin Productions. P is a distributor code. L is the production code for Limelight. Handwritten mistakes. Mistakes due to handwriting can result when codes are copied from one still to another. Here are a couple of clips from 2 stills from the film Hanny Calder. The production code is HC for Hanny Calder. It appears correctly as H in the top clip, but is clearly written as M in the bottom clip. Backwards printing. Production codes may appear in a reverse order due to the film being placed on the wrong side when reproducing the stills. Here is a sample from the film The Bride Wore Red. Holding the still to a mirror will reverse the code, which in this case is 997-41. Codes chopped. It is fairly common for the production code to be placed so close to the edge of the still that it gets cropped when reproduced. This can be extremely frustrating when you are trying to identify the title and only have one still on that title. When you see the code right up against the edge, always look to another still if possible. In our example from the film The Incredible Shrinking Man, the production code is located at the left-hand edge of the still and appears to be 828. Fortunately, a snipe was attached which indicates that the production code is actually 1828. Same codes on remakes. Here is one final common problem. Remakes of films using different actors, but the same code. Many studios would remake a film 5 or 10 years later with other actors, but then use the same production code. In our examples, the 1932 Warner Brothers film 2 Against the World, starring Constance Bennett and Neil Hamilton, had the production code TW. In 1936, Warner Brothers released another film named 2 Against the World, starring Humphrey Bogart and Beverly Roberts, with the same TW production code. When problems or oddities arise, or when there are multiple options on that code, you basically have to become a detective and look for clues. Look for any additional information on the front or back of the still, such as director, studio, any cast member or members. The more you find, the better the odds of finding the title. You may have to cross-reference some information like directors and year, actor and year, etc. We hope this presentation helps you understand how production codes were used and what to look for when trying to utilize the production code to help you identify those unknown movie stills, props, or costumes. There are a few places you can go that has recorded the codes from the different studios over the years, but we would like to show you what LAMP has done to help you identify more of those elusive, unknown titles. In 2019, LAMP released the new production code database. It currently has over 85,000 codes and adding approximately 100 more codes each month. If you have a small number of unknown stills with production codes, up to 10, email us and we'll help to try to identify them. If you have a larger number of unknown stills or need them on a regular basis, access to our production code database requires a LAMP membership, which is only $60 per year. Contact Ed at edp@learnaboutmovieposters.com.
Thank you for watching this Learn About Movie Posters presentation. For more information, visit learnaboutmovieposters.com.